In the dead of night, with a heavy fog settled over the tracks, the old steam train rumbled forward. This particular line, known as the ghost train route among locals, was one of the oldest in the country. The tracks cut through desolate stretches of forest and desolate hills, where mist curled in ghostly tendrils and strange sounds were known to haunt the air. Train number 4071 was making its way through one of the darkest parts of the route, and as usual, there were hardly any passengers. Those who knew its reputation didn't take this train lightly. Peter was the only passenger in his carriage. He'd boarded at a remote station to visit an ailing aunt, but was already regretting it. The train felt unnaturally cold, and despite the heating, he found himself shivering under his coat. Outside, the fog pressed against the window like something alive, blanketing everything beyond the tracks. As the train rattled and swayed, Peter noticed a figure moving toward him from the other end of the carriage. The man wore an old-fashioned conductor's uniform, and his steps made no sound on the wooden floor. Peter shifted uncomfortably. The conductor looked as if he'd stepped straight out of the 1800s. His clothes were worn, his face pale, and his eyes cold as ice. "Ticket, sir?" the conductor asked in a whispery voice. Peter handed over his ticket, his fingers trembling slightly. The conductor examined it closely, then looked up at Peter with a strange glint in his eyes. "You know," he said, his voice carrying a hint of sorrow, "these tracks hold stories, tragedies. Some of us never really left." Before Peter could ask what he meant, the conductor handed back the ticket and moved on, fading into the shadows at the far end of the carriage. The eerie encounter left Peter on edge. He peered down the length of the train, but the conductor had vanished as if he'd never been there. Minutes later, the train screeched to a sudden stop, throwing Peter forward in his seat. Outside the window, he could see they were nowhere near a station. They were in the middle of a dense, silent forest. A low fog hung over the ground, swirling in ghostly patterns. The door to the carriage creaked open, and Peter braced himself, expecting the conductor to return, but no one appeared. Suddenly, Peter heard faint footsteps from the carriage behind him. The sound was soft, like someone barefoot, shuffling along the floor. He looked back, but there was nothing to see except shadows. A chill crawled up his spine. The footsteps drew closer, echoing against the empty seats. And then Peter saw her. A woman in a tattered white dress, her face pale and hollow, her eyes dark and empty. She stared directly at him, unmoving. Peter's mouth went dry as he struggled to make sense of what he was seeing. The woman raised a finger to her lips as if to shush him, and then she turned, drifting toward the end of the carriage. Compelled by something he couldn't explain, Peter got up and followed her. His steps felt heavy, as if each footfall sank him deeper into something unseen. She moved quickly, almost floating, as she led him through carriage after carriage. Finally, they arrived in an older part of the train that Peter hadn't noticed before. This carriage was dimly lit, with peeling wallpaper and worn wooden benches instead of the modern seats he'd been sitting in. The woman stopped and pointed to an empty seat. On it was a faded newspaper, and as Peter bent to look, he felt the air turn icy cold. The headline read, "Train 4071 crash claims 47 lives. Only conductor survives." The article detailed the tragic crash from decades ago on this very route. But what froze Peter's blood was the photograph beneath it. The grainy image showed the survivors of the crash, including a young man with haunted eyes. The caption named him as Peter Radcliffe. Peter staggered back, heart pounding. How could that be his name? And then he remembered. Fragmented memories began to surface. The train ride, the crash, the bodies sprawled across the tracks. He'd been the only one to survive, or so he'd thought. But in his heart, he'd never really left that train. He was doomed to ride it night after night, forever reliving the horror of that crash. The woman gave him a sad smile, and as the train began to move again, he felt himself fading, becoming part of the mist that clung to the train. The midnight train rolled into Fox Hollow Station, its wheels screeching against the rails. Only a few people boarded that night. No one liked to travel the late train in these parts, where strange things were known to happen along the rails. The few passengers settled into the flickering, dimly lit carriages, shivering at the unnatural chill that seemed to seep through the walls. Danny was a student coming home late after visiting a friend in the city. He hadn't planned on taking this particular train, but had missed the earlier one by minutes. As he took his seat, he noticed how empty and eerily quiet the train was. Outside, fog swirled thickly, pressing against the windows and making the train feel isolated from the world. A few minutes into the ride, Danny glanced across the aisle and froze. A man sat directly across from him, staring with an expressionless face, his eyes unblinking. The man was dressed in an outdated black suit with a bowler hat, the kind that might have been worn a century ago. Something was wrong with his face. It was pale, waxy, and almost too perfect, like a mannequin's face. "Do you know what happens on these tracks?" the man asked, his voice strange, flat, and devoid of any inflection. Danny looked around, unnerved. No one else seemed to notice the strange man. They were lost in their own world, reading or sleeping. "I don't," Danny replied hesitantly, his voice barely a whisper. The man continued to stare, his eyes unfathomably deep. "People vanish here," he said softly. "Trains pass, but not all reach the destination." Before Danny could respond, the man turned his head abruptly, as if he'd heard something in the distance. His face went rigid, and a tense silence filled the carriage. Suddenly, the train lurched, and the lights flickered. The overhead bulbs buzzed, casting shadows that seemed to stretch and move across the seats. A strange sound echoed from the back of the train, an eerie scraping like metal grinding against metal. Danny's heart pounded as he turned to look, but the shadows had swallowed the rear of the carriage. He could see nothing but darkness. "Did you hear that?" Danny asked, turning back to the strange man. But the seat was empty. The man in the black suit had vanished. Panic began to set in. Danny looked around, hoping to see another passenger, someone who might offer an explanation. But when he looked back at the rest of the train, it seemed different. The passengers he'd seen earlier were gone, and the seats were covered in a thin layer of dust. The windows were grimy, and the carriage was dimmer than before, as if he'd somehow crossed into another version of the train. His chest tightened as the scraping sound grew louder, closer. He knew he had to move to get to the next carriage. He stumbled toward the door, but when he reached for it, the handle was cold, freezing cold, as if he'd touched solid ice. Pulling his hand away, he saw frostbite-like blisters forming on his fingertips. As he reeled back, a figure emerged from the shadows at the far end of the carriage. At first, it looked like a person, but then he noticed the figure's unsettling, unnatural movements. It shambled forward in jerky motions, its limbs twisting and bending in impossible angles. Its face was a hollow void, no eyes, no mouth, just a blank expanse where features should have been. Danny's mind screamed at him to run, but his body was frozen with terror. The figure dragged itself closer, one agonizing step at a time, filling the air with that awful scraping noise. As it moved, its head tilted toward him, and even without eyes, Danny could feel it staring, something cold and empty peering into him. The lights above flickered faster, casting the figure in flashes of light and darkness. In the dim glow, Danny saw flashes of more faces, faces of people who looked terrified, their mouths open in silent screams. They seemed to be etched into the walls, their eyes wide with fear, as if they were trapped within the very fabric of the train. Desperate, Danny forced himself to back away. He stumbled to the door, shoving it open just as the train jolted to a stop. He fell into the next carriage, slamming the door behind him. Breathing heavily, he braced himself, half expecting the figure to appear at any moment. When he looked up, he was no longer on the old dimly lit train. The carriage he found himself in was brightly lit, modern, and filled with people. The passengers looked at him with confused expressions as he lay sprawled on the floor. "Are you all right?" an elderly woman asked, her tone gentle. Danny stammered something incoherent, his heart still racing. He looked around, struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The train was perfectly normal, bustling with life. But as he looked out the window, he caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. The train was passing through a tunnel, and in the darkness he saw his reflection. It wasn't his face staring back at him. It was the face of the man in the black suit, with cold, lifeless eyes and an eerie, unnatural stillness. In that moment, Danny understood. He'd never left that other train. He was still there, somewhere on the old midnight line, destined to ride forever, just another lost soul in the ghostly depths of the tracks. The storm was relentless, hammering rain and howling winds against the roof of the old train station. Lydia was grateful when the midnight train finally screeched to a halt at the platform, its headlights piercing the mist that hung over the tracks. She was the only one on the platform, soaked to the bone from her long walk. She'd missed the last bus, and the only way to reach her sister's house for the night was to take this train, known for running late and passing through some of the country's most isolated towns. The train seemed empty as she boarded, and her footsteps echoed as she made her way down the narrow aisle. The carriage was dimly lit, casting an unsettling yellowish glow over the seats. The air was stale, filled with the faint smell of dust and something metallic. Lydia sat by a window, shivering slightly as she settled in, hoping to get a few hours of sleep. As the train started moving, she noticed something odd. Outside, the landscape was nearly pitch black, except for occasional flashes of lightning. But whenever the lightning struck, it briefly illuminated a vast, sprawling graveyard on either side of the tracks, with crooked tombstones jutting out of the mist. She hadn't known about any cemetery near the route and figured it was her imagination playing tricks in the strange light. The train rattled on, moving slowly, and she tried to relax. But the feeling of unease only grew stronger. She felt like she was being watched. Glancing around, she saw no one else in the carriage. The seats behind and in front of her were empty. But then, as lightning flashed again, Lydia caught a glimpse of something in the reflection of the window. A dark figure sitting directly across from her. Heart pounding, she whipped around, but the seat was empty. She tried to convince herself that it was just her mind playing tricks. But the sensation of being watched remained, intensifying with every second. Minutes later, the train came to a jarring halt. It was strange. There was no station nearby, just the desolate cemetery stretching endlessly into the dark. Lydia waited, expecting an announcement or a conductor to come through, but no one appeared. She looked out the window, straining to see anything in the storm, when a light flickered on in the distance. The light bobbed closer, and she realized it was a lantern, swinging from the hand of a figure walking slowly toward the train. As the figure drew closer, she could make out a man in an old-fashioned conductor's uniform, his face shadowed under the brim of his cap. He climbed aboard the train and walked up the aisle, his footsteps eerily silent. As he passed her seat, he stopped, turning his head just enough for her to see his face. It was pale, hollow, with dark, empty eye sockets staring straight through her. "Ticket, please," he whispered in a hoarse, rasping voice. Trembling, Lydia handed him her ticket, not daring to look directly into those hollow eyes. The conductor took it, and as he moved to the next seat, his lantern cast a brief glow on the seats around her. That's when Lydia saw them. Passengers filling every seat, all sitting perfectly still. Their faces were ghastly pale, their eyes wide open, staring blankly ahead. They were dressed in old, outdated clothing, some with hats and coats covered in dust and cobwebs. She realized with a jolt that their clothes were from different eras, some from decades, even centuries ago. Each face was frozen in an expression of terror. Lydia shrank back in her seat, covering her mouth to stifle a scream. She looked around for a way out, but the aisle was filled with these silent figures, blocking her escape. The train jolted forward again, moving even slower than before, and the conductor continued down the aisle, his lantern casting shadows that seemed to twist and writhe. Lydia felt her heart racing as she glanced out the window again, desperately hoping the storm had ended, that there might be some sign of normalcy outside. But the graveyard was still there, stretching on endlessly, with rows of tombstones seeming to multiply with every flash of lightning. Then she saw it, a headstone with her own name carved into it. Her blood went cold. The date on the headstone was that very night. She frantically pressed against the window, desperate to get off the train, to somehow escape whatever nightmare she was trapped in. But the window wouldn't budge, and the faces around her remained eerily still, watching her with blank, lifeless eyes. The conductor returned, stopping at her seat once again. This time his face had changed. It was hollowed out as if decayed over centuries, his grin twisted in a way that stretched his skin taut over his bones. "You missed your stop," he said, his voice echoing strangely. "But don't worry, there's a place for everyone on this train." The other passengers began to turn their heads toward her, one by one, each movement slow and mechanical. Their mouths opened in unison, silent screams that filled the carriage with an overwhelming sense of dread. Panicking, Lydia leapt from her seat and rushed down the aisle, pushing past the ghostly figures, her heartbeat roaring in her ears. She stumbled to the back of the train, reaching a door that led to the next carriage. But when she flung it open, she found herself staring at the same carriage she'd just left, the same ghostly passengers watching her with hollow eyes. No matter which way she turned, she was trapped, looping endlessly through the same carriages, the same silent, staring faces. Finally, the train began to slow, the grinding of the brakes filling the air. The doors opened onto a deserted platform shrouded in thick fog. Lydia stumbled off, hoping she was free. But when she looked around, she realized she was back at the same station where she'd boarded. As the train pulled away, she caught a glimpse of herself in one of the windows. Her reflection was ghostly pale, with dark, hollow eyes staring back at her, just like the other passengers. And then she realized with a shudder of horror, she was no longer alone. A feeling of cold, suffocating dread settled over her as she watched the train disappear into the mist, carrying her along with it. A lost soul doomed to ride forever through the ghostly graveyards and empty stations, bound to the midnight train and its endless, silent journey.